So I got a bunch of people together in a room several months ago, and I said, you know, we've got this over 80 stuff, and to me it seems like a fairly large and complicated pool. And I was wondering if there was any ways. There's a cell phone. Thank you for reminding me. Everybody, turn your cell phones off. Wayne, I see you smirking. No, not you. I said that at the LiDAR workshop a couple weeks ago, and uh-oh, it was mine. So anyway, we got a group of people together and talked about how there's this large range of conditions, as you just saw Ray describe. And I was wondering if there was any way that we could talk about kind of bucketing it for the discussion. And they said to me, well, it's really important on where the stands come from. That's going to drive their condition and how they fall into place over time. So we've asked today Jane Curtis, who's an ecologist with the Northwest Oregon group, and Matt Reilly, he's a research assistant here at OSU, to talk to us about where have these stands come from. And I think it'll get a little bit more detail and put some meat on what Ray had to talk about here a few minutes ago. So where have they come from and where are they going? So help me welcome Jane and Matt.
Okay, I'm Jane, in case you were wondering. And I am going to start this presentation off. Well, as Cheryl said, Matt and I were tasked with helping to answer, or at least shed some light on three general questions. Where historically did forests that we see today come from? What do they look like now, and where are they going? Since of the two of us, I was by far the oldest and probably had seen into the past most, I was tasked with answering the first question, and Matt's going to tackle the next two. So, in terms of trying to answer the question of where did they come from, I'm going to talk a little bit about just some general vegetation development concepts, really look at what some of the key influences were on our historical vegetation, and look at the resultant vegetation pathways, and then bring us up into the 20th century in terms of looking mostly at fire. So there's a classic notion of forest succession or forest development that basically says that there is a gradual and a very orderly process of change that forests go through, moving through progressive successional and or vegetation states, structural states, until they reach a climax stage and happily stay there. There's been many attempts to classify vegetation structural pathways into discrete stages to really better help us understand and describe the different components that Ray mentioned and how they coordinate in the range of stand conditions that we see through time. Those stages can be quite simple. Let me see if I can find the quite simple, like the ones that Oliver and Larson proposed, constituting just 4 stages, or they can be much more rich and complex, as Franklin and all basically put together. Go back and forth here. But they all really pretty much use the same general components to describe stands. In terms of how much light is getting to the ground by way of canopy cover, what is the size and distribution and species of live trees, and also how much snags and coarse wood do we have. And those are really, as you heard from Ray, the same components that are being used in the OGSI as well. So there are a lot of processes that really affect the speed and direction that vegetation structural stages take through time. And really broad scale changes in climate and physical environment really drive what kinds of species live on a site and also how quickly they grow. And mortality is really a function of both physical and biological processes. So things like interstand competition for resources, as well as wind and pathogens and insects, at least in our part of the world, really function at more the within stand or kind of medium landscape scale, whereas fire really operates at a wide variety of scales. So there's been a link between climate and vegetation composition that goes way, way back in history, way before I was on this planet anyway. And this is a good example from some of the work that Long and his colleagues did at Little Lake, which is a little lake in the central Oregon Coast Range. And basically what it shows here is you can see the amount of pollen is on the bottom here, and it's linked to the vegetation types that were there at the time. And then time basically goes from top to bottom. And the really interesting thing here to me is that you can see that in the early Holocene, 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, it was a pretty warm and dry climate at the Little Lake area, and there were vegetation assemblages of oak and Douglas fir and bracken fern. And as the temperature became cooler and more humid, there were some big vegetation shifts to western hemlock and western red cedar, and kind of started to look more like the vegetation that we see today. So we've used these concepts of broad gradients in temperature and precipitation, as well as soil and landform characteristics, to really identify biophysical environments. And we've named those biophysical environments by the dominant overstory tree that would exist there given no disturbance. And this is a map of the potential vegetation zones, as they're called, across the western part of our region. And as you can see, as Ray alluded to, western hemlock, which is here in green, kind of dominates the lower to middle elevations, followed by Pacific silver fir, which is in the light pink in the Cascades, and then at the crest, mountain hemlock. We also want to note that we're seeing basically an influx of Douglas fir climax, as well as white fir and grand fir in the southwest part. So fire really is the dominant landscape process that we have in West Side forests. It does operate at a wide variety of spatial and temporal scales. And so thus it produces a wide variety of effects at the stand and landscape level around the four components that I mentioned earlier. So back to the pollen graph at Little Lake in the Central Oregon Coast Range. Long also looked at charcoal in lake sediments and was able to do a very long-term fire history at that site. And what he found, again, was a very strong link between climate, vegetation, and fire. And you can see here that the warmer, drier climate and vegetation produced more frequent fire history. And as we move into cooler and more humid conditions, the fire history followed suit by becoming less frequent. We're really lucky in this part of the world because we have a plethora of fire history studies that have happened. And from that, Weisberg and Swanson put together a synthesis of fire on West Side forests through time. And what they found was we have two, and actually we're looking at more modern history, so we go from 1400 to 2000. What they found, in fact, was there's a clear regional signal with two periods of very high fire activity in the 1400s to 1500s, and then in the 1800s here. And those periods of high fire activity are linked also with warm periods historically, with a warm break in the Little Ice Age actually being linked at least with some of the high fire activity in the 1400s, and then a warming period in the 1800s. Another thing to note is that there was a relative lull in the 1600s and the 1700s across the west side that is probably somewhat influenced by the height of the Little Ice Age during that same time period. So because of this wealth of information in fire history, we're really able to look at and characterize the role of fire on our landscapes by describing fire regimes. And a fire regime really describes how often fire visits an area, how much mortality it imposes, and what the extent is. And that obviously would have an effect on the composition and structure and pattern of our landscapes. So we have 3 fire regimes that are expressed across West Side Forest, and I'm going to spend a little time going through each one. The first fire regime is the infrequent stand replacement fire regime, and that was most common in the coastal forests of Sitka spruce and western hemlock in the Coast Range ecoregion, and it was also very dominant in the northern part of the West Cascades ecoregion. And as you head further south in this ecoregion, it becomes more localized in extent. So the stand development pathways in this particular fire regime basically march through time because of the very long time period between fires, greater than 200 years. So stands are able to kind of march through time and basically end up as late successional old growth and may exist for quite some time before fires reset the stand and the landscape. So this age class map from the Oregon Coast Range from 1940 that Teensma put together is a really great example of showing the extent of fires in this fire regime. The colors, basically orange stands for recently burned, and the brown is basically very young forest that likely had been burned not that long ago. And then contrast that with the late successional forests, which are in the old forests, which are in dark green here. And I think the thing that really jumps out at you is the extent and of the fires that occurred from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s here, all of which are well over 300,000 acres in size. However, you can also see from this photograph from the Nestucca fire that even with these large stand replacement fire events, there are islands or pockets within the fire perimeter where stands or trees actually survived and could actually provide seed source for future forest development. However, you also notice that there's quite a few reburns associated with each one of these fires, and that may somewhat be responsible for the lack of western hemlock seed source that I know we've experienced in the Coast Range. So in order to get a real handle on what the variability in vegetation structure pattern was on the landscape, we really need to do some modeling. And Wimberly took a look at what the historical range of variability was among structure classes by modeling across the whole Coast Range, Oregon Coast Range ecoregion, which is really appropriate given the extent of the fire size extent in that fire regime. And what he found here was just from a single model run. This is an illustration just to give you a handle on pattern of the different structure classes. And the thing that immediately jumps out to me is the preponderance of large patches on the landscape. And what he found after multiple runs was, if you look at this figure here with the structure classes listed down below, was that the old growth structure class dominated the Coast Range province historically, ranging in area from about 30 to about 50%. And just on the other side of the successional groups, early seral occupied somewhere between 10 and 30%. The other thing he looked at was the large patch dynamic in the Coast Range. And what he found was that the median large patch through time was somewhere around 250,000 acres in the old growth, and obviously ranged quite a bit, with the remaining structure stages being somewhere around 100,000 acres. So those are some big patches. So let's move to the mixed severity fire regime. And I think, well, first I'll talk about where it exists and then talk a little bit about the characteristics of it. So this fire regime probably is the most dominant from the central West Cascades down through to the south, and also you find it in the Klamath Mountain ecoregion. And variability is really the name of the game in this this fire regime. There were variable frequencies ranging from 30 to 150, variable proportions of severities that were expressed at any one fire, and also variable extent. So you can see the result of that on the potential structural pathways, and basically the pathways are way more than I could show here, but essentially what I do want to talk about is that these post-burn stands really kind of get you on an alternative pathway or many alternative pathways. And those pathways can either hasten or delay some of the components of old growth in terms of live trees, diameter diversity. But one thing we do know they do is they certainly supply a pulse of snags and down wood to the system. So if you thought that that little cartoon was complicated, you can take a look at this one if you want. I think, I don't want you to, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I did want to show that Tepley and colleagues took a lot of time to kind of come up with the wide variety of pathways that are possible in the mixed severity regime. And I think the biggest thing I want to point out is that the frequency of mixed severity fires really has an effect on how many of these pathways are expressed on the landscape. So I'll leave it at that. I do want to mention in these fire regimes the importance of the precipitation and topography. What you can see here, Teensma and colleagues again synthesized information from fire history projects along a precipitation gradient. And they also looked at the proportion of stands that had Douglas fir had 2 or greater Douglas fir cohorts, which gives you a handle kind of on the number and types of fire that we have in our intermediate disturbances. And what they found was in the wet forest types, the Bull Run and the north part of the Oregon Cascades, a fairly small percentage, less than a quarter of the stands, had 2 or more cohorts of Douglas fir within a stand. And compare that as you head further south in the drier types that we see at Little River on the Umpqua. Basically 80% or more of the stands had at least 2 Douglas fir cohorts within them. So precipitation definitely plays a role. And as we head further south, topography starts to play a pretty important role as well. And you can see that illustrated here in the distribution of early 20th century fires in Western Oregon. So farthest north we have a large, before I talk about this, I did want to mention that when they mapped fires in the early 20th century, they basically only mapped the high severity portion of fires. So fire size might actually be a lot bigger. So think of this as high severity patches within the mixed severity fire regime. So what you can see is that there are definitely larger patches of high severity expressed in moister conditions. Then as we head further south, the patch sizes become smaller and more dispersed. And that is likely due to the effects of topography, where south slopes and ridge tops have a tendency to burn more severely, and potentially more frequently than north slopes and more protected areas. So we're really seeing the impact of precipitation and topography very nicely in this map. So another illustration of the variability that one might see in expression of this fire regime on the landscape is a study that was done in the Cook-Quentin watershed area in the central West Cascades on the Willamette National Forest. Morrison and Swanson mapped fire severity patches. They looked at high severity as mortality greater than 70%, moderate severity 30 to 70%, and low severity less than 30%. And they mapped those patches for the 1800 to 1900 fires. And just to give you a sense of scale, we're looking at a 9,000 acre area. What they found was that there's almost equal amount of area in each of the fire severity groups. Maybe a little more of the moderate severity patch area was expressed here. The other thing they found was that a lot of, as you can imagine, and you can see here, a lot of variability in patch size. In the high severity patches, they found that most of them were actually relatively small, less than 25 acres, and there were only a couple that were pretty large at 250 acres in size. So we do in fact have the frequent low severity fire regime expressed in West Side forests. I know that's hard to believe for some people, but we do have it. It's most common in the Willamette Valley and in the kind of southern end of the West Cascades here, and then also in the Klamath Mountains. The generalized pathway in this type, because of the really frequent fire return interval, really gives us forests that are very open and probably somewhat limited in diameter diversity and also very limited in coarse wood. So this is just an example of a couple of the types. So this is a photo of Oregon white oak savanna in the Willamette Valley. And some examples from mixed conifer and ponderosa pine. I want to mention that these two photos actually come from the Jims Creek area on the south end of the Willamette National Forest. So yes, we do have drier forests, even in the central Western Cascades. So now let's move up a little bit to the 20th century, and let's take a look at fire activity. So this graph here that Littell put together on fire activity in the 20th century for 11 western forests, really the fire activity that we see in Oregon and Washington on the west side really mirrors this, with a lot of fire activity happening in the early part of the century, and then a big lull in the mid part, and then maybe a little bit of a pickup of fire activity in the latter part of the 20th century. And these are illustrations here with a map of Oregon, Western Oregon in the early 1900s, and then a map of more recent fires from 1970 to 2014. One thing I wanted to point out here is that, yes, indeed, we do get a lot of lightning activity. The black dots actually are a map of lightning strikes that actually created fires. I don't have them graded as to fire size, but I will tell you that the majority of them were relatively small in size, largely due to fire suppression efforts. So I have the fires that occurred in the turn of the century, and the blow-ups here are just to show you that we in fact have had many opportunities for fire starts to create stand diversity in some of the forest patches that were created at the turn of the century fires. And I would just hazard you to think a little bit about what the landscape would look like if even a small proportion of these fire starts grew to be a little bit bigger in size, and what the change in structural diversity might be on the landscape today. So with that, I think we're going to segue into today.
Great, thanks Jane. And so I'm going to pick up where Jane left off and start talking about where we are now at the moment. And I have up here a map of basically the 1930s forest cover class. This was compiled by, I guess, Connie Harrington. It was the result of one of the first regional inventories here in the Pacific Northwest. And I want you to broadly take a look at the reds there, which are sort of the fires that Jane was showing, and then the yellows and the blacks represent either post-logging or younger forests that are developing. And then the blues represent either old-growth forests or those that still had large diameter trees. And so at the end of the 1930s, this is pretty much what we're looking at across Western Oregon and Washington. And so when we talk about where we are now, a lot of that is largely a part of those legacies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The next thing I'm going to do is describe a new structure-based framework, another way to look at old growthedness, kind of an alternative to an age-based approach. And then we're going to look at the geographic distribution of some of the different structural conditions that are out there and how they vary with environment and biophysical setting in different vegetation zones and different disturbance histories. So just to take a brief look, this is data from the FIA annual, which includes all ownerships. It was collected between 2000 and 2010. So it's probably the best recent snapshot of what's actually out there. And so you can see that actually about half of the forests out there across all ownerships are over 80 years old. When you split them into some finer age classes, 80 to 120, 120 to 200, greater than 200, it's a fairly even distribution. There's some differences in where they occur. Some of the really, really old stuff is predominantly in the colder, higher elevation vegetation zones, mountain hemlock and silver fir. And then the 80 to 120 is a little bit more concentrated in the western hemlock. So, is this really all we need to know about what's happening out there and what we have in terms of forests and forest conditions across the region? Probably not. It doesn't really give us a good idea of how much variation there is in structure and how things differ. Potentially not really useful for predicting wildlife habitat. And so we maybe could try another approach. And this is what I'm going to call the strictly structure-based approach. And there's multiple components of forest structure out there. The traditional approaches to structural development that Jane presented are primarily based on this monotonic accumulation of biomass over time. And so forests grow when they're young and they accumulate live biomass and get bigger trees and then sort of plateau and maybe decrease a little bit at the end. But we do know that not all forests out there work like that. Sometimes we get these partial stand replacing disturbances where there might be drops in live biomass and potentially inputs into the dead pool. And so we have other dimensions aside from live biomass and big trees that potentially vary independently of that biomass dimension. Some of these things are the density of live trees. How many trees are there? Snag biomass, snag density, biomass of dead and down wood, and then also understory vegetation. And so what I did to come up with this structure-based framework is I used this approach called hierarchical classification, and it's basically this statistical technique or algorithm, and it's somewhat similar to what the folks out there that watch us on the internet use to put us in different bins as far as consumers. Kind of a big data approach, and based on the similarity in these different attributes, live trees, basal area, snags, dead wood, it iteratively pairs up plots starting at the bottom and puts them into groups that are more and more similar. And so, you know, for a first cut as to some of the results, we can take a very coarse look and put things into groups based on biomass, low, moderate, and high biomass, which doesn't really give us a whole lot to work with. And so we might take another cut and go a little bit deeper, and here we have 11 classes. And here things start breaking out, in addition to biomass, they start breaking out into different density classes and tree sizes and things like that. Some of the snags start popping out. And then if we really want to go nuts, we can go all the way down to 25 types. And here you start seeing structure expressed in terms of dead biomass, understory vegetation, and sort of all these attributes that I've thrown in there. So what does it actually look like? What do these types and classes and things look like? Do they correspond to some of the things we already expect are out there? Yeah, and sure they do. Some of the usual suspects pop out. Type 1.1, extremely low biomass with lots of snags, is sort of a post-standard placing fire. That pops out. Type 3, low live biomass and high density with small trees. Very, very similar to a canopy closure stage in some of the other traditional models. 6.2, moderate live biomass and density with big trees and snags, a very, very structurally diverse type, primarily associated with fires, open canopies, lots of big trees, lots of dead wood, lots of snags. And finally, we can keep going through and we get to structural class 11, which is extremely high live biomass with giant trees. And this is, you know, sort of our traditional old growth forest that we might think of when we think of Western Oregon. So the question is now, where do stands that are older than 80 fall into this classification? And so what I have here is, this again is from the FIA annual, and so this is across all ownerships in Western Oregon and Washington. And on the left side, it's the percent of forests greater than 80 years. This is just forests greater than 80 years. And then along the y-axis, I have things lined up in order of increasing biomass. And sure enough, no surprise, the majority of these end up in the high biomass class. And so the majority of these stands that are over 80 have things like big trees, varying amounts of dead biomass. But it's interesting to see that structure is expressed in a very, very wide variety of ways in terms of some of these lower and moderate biomass types. And so as you move to the left there, you'll see sort of an increasing abundance of some of these lower productivity vegetation zones. And so for instance, low live biomass and low density is sort of a slower, protracted stage of regeneration. And you see more of it in the drier Douglas fir and in subalpine forests. You don't see very much of it in western hemlock. And so depending on the biophysical environment, these 80-plus-year-old stage can look, forests can look very, very, very different. So we're going to take a closer look at just a few of these. I'm not going to go through all 25 of them. But some of the ones that might be a little bit more pertinent, Class 8, high live biomass and density. Here you're starting to get trees greater than 20 inches. Most of them have low dead wood. Snag density is generally very low. They vary tremendously in terms of density from about 400 trees per hectare to 800 trees per hectare. And if you look up in the top right, you can see that their abundance differs a great deal depending on your biophysical setting and your vegetation zone. So across the entire region, these make up almost 20% of the forests out there. In western hemlock, it's up at 28%. Grand fir, white fir, it's way down at 10%. And so some of the interesting things you can do with this is to take a closer look and dig in. And one of these types has very high biomass of dead and down wood. And if we map this out on top of that map that I showed you at the beginning from the 1930s condition classes, we can see that, wow, some of these came in after the Tillamook burn. There's a pretty dense concentration there over in the Coast Range. So potentially some of these are plantations that came in after fire, while other ones maybe came in after clear cuts, or maybe they're just starting to develop some dead biomass now. So even when you go down to this fine level, there's multiple pathways that these things could have developed through. We'll take another look. This is class 11, extremely high live biomass with giant trees, our typical Western Oregon old growth. Across the entire region, it makes up about 12% of the forested area. Silver fir, where there was far less logging, there haven't been many fires in quite a while. It's almost 25% of the vegetation zone. Over on the drier side, grand fir and white fir, Douglas fir, they make up maybe 7 or 5%. And even within these forests, you can see that they're extremely variable. Here, these types differ in density. One has 400 trees per hectare, the other has 800 trees per hectare. And if we map these out in terms of the conditions that we saw in the 1930s, we see that, yeah, they predominantly overlap with the blues, which were stands that were predominantly dominated by large trees or that were called old growth in the 1930s. And so these probably represent stands that have never been cut, even in the most productive vegetation zones. We take another look, sort of a geographic look. We can see kind of a gradient in the makeup of these as we go from north to south. Up in the north with the gray dots are the higher density types. And as we go further south, especially down into the West Cascades, we see potentially a greater abundance of the lower density ones. And we'll take a look at one more of these types, another one of the more interesting ones, I think, and this is class 6. It has moderate biomass and density, but it also has lots of big trees and lots of snags. And so when we see this structural pattern, we start thinking that some of the processes behind this are mortality. And indeed, when you break this down into further structural types, the 6.2, I think 90% of it is associated with wildfires that have occurred since 1984. And there's very, very high snag density, very, very high snag biomass. So this class is potentially representative of these higher biomass classes that have potentially recently gone through some sort of mortality event. Insects, lots and lots of thinning, or low and moderate severity fire. When we look across the region, they're pretty rare, depending on where you are. Region-wide, 3%. Of that 3%, a tiny, tiny fraction of it is that 6.2, that really diverse structural type. But if you go up into subalpine forests, which make up a really, really, really small fraction of the area we're actually talking about, they make up almost 2%. And then if we map these and overlap them with some of the fires that have happened since 1984, indeed we see some pretty good spatial correspondence, especially with that 6.2 type with lots and lots of snags. You can see there's some hot spots there down in the Biscuit Fire, up by the B&B. And then the grayer type with high snag density, but not really, really high snag density, is sort of scattered across the region. I don't know, potentially indicative of where insects and things like that may have been operating. So the next thing is, well, we have this new classification, and it's based exclusively on structure. We haven't brought age into it all yet. And so how do these buckets that come out actually correspond with age? And I'm going to break it down into the western hemlock and the grand fir vegetation zone. And if you look at western hemlock, again, these structural classes are lined up, increasing live biomass and basal area. We see that there's actually a fairly good correspondence that as you increase into the higher biomass structural classes, age generally increases. If we go to the grand fir and white fir, it's a little bit of a different story. At the low end there, we see some differentiation. But you start getting into the moderate biomass classes, and there's a lot of overlap there in age and what stand age is telling us. And so potentially in these drier forests, stand age isn't going to be quite as useful in terms of predicting some of the structural conditions that we might be interested in. So basically what I'm telling you is we now have this structure-based approach, but age doesn't always work real well, and that there really isn't any sort of silver bullet for doing this. And so what I've had to do to make these a little bit more ecologically interpretable and put them in terms of stages of structural development was to go through and interpret them myself. And here I have, again, the western hemlock and the Douglas fir. And it's pretty easy to stick these bins into different developmental stages in the low biomass ones. Pretty much all of those are early developmental stages. But as you get up into the high ones, it gets a little bit stickier. What might be, you know, a mature or late developmental stage in western hemlock, where things grow very, very fast and development is rapid, might be an old growth condition in grand fir and white fir, potentially, since dead wood on the ground is maybe not as big a component of these old growth structural conditions in those. And so it's a little bit sticky, and there is definitely some subjective interpretation that needs to go into any application based with this. And so just a quick review, you know, stands over 80, there's a lot of them out there. Most of them have high biomass, but there's tremendous structural diversity out there. And age may be indicative of structural conditions in some places, but not in others. And so it may not always give us a good bar to gauge things by. And then finally, that, you know, even 100 years later, there's still very, very strong legacies of past disturbance and the productivity gradients that we see out there. So moving along to where we're going. And what I'm going to do now is discuss some results from some data I've been working with that correspond specifically to U.S. Forest Service lands in Western Oregon and Washington. And so some of the concerns out there that there's been this documentation of increasing background mortality rates. And I have a figure here that shows that from the 1970s, these background mortality rates have increased from around 0.5% per year to almost 1.5% per year. And so maybe it doesn't sound like a big difference, 1% per year, but it compounds over time. And so small changes in these mortality rates over time can really have large ecological implications in terms of structural change and things like that. And so the period that I'm going to be talking about falls right about at that 1% per year mark, so keep that in mind. And so background mortality is, of course, important, but it's not the whole story. What about insects and fires and disease? What's going on out there with those? How are those affecting stands greater than 80 years? And then finally, a little bit, we'll talk about sort of what some of the cumulative effects of mortality on growth and abundance of forests greater than 80 years. So to look at mortality rates, I use data from the Current Vegetation Survey. And so the rates that I'm going to be talking about, it represents a very, very dense sample, about 1,700 plots, but it corresponds to a pretty short moment in time, basically the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. And I'm going to look strictly at plots that had no evidence of management during the interval. So all the mortality that I'll be talking about can be attributed to natural agents. And so there's about 160,000 tagged trees. And what I did for all these plots was each one has a plot narrative that was written when they're installed on the present condition and past disturbance. And so I went through about 3,600 of these and basically took notes on mentions of specific agents of disturbance, disease, pathogens, fire, insects, avalanche, flood, things like that. And instead of subjectively assigning some sort of severity to the disturbance, I just am using these as strictly a presence absence. And the goal here is to let the mortality rate tell the severity story. And it gives us a chance to look at the range of mortality levels that these different disturbance agents are operating across. And so, yeah, on the far right there, this is just a distribution of the plots. There's a lot of them. They're evenly distributed across the region. It's a good systematic sample. Several large wildfires during this period, the Biscuit, the B&B, a couple down there in the Umpqua. And so it's an active period to look at this mortality question. And so first of all, we're going to look at what I'm going to call background mortality. And this is going to include plots with no evidence of disturbance, those with insects, and those with pathogens and disease. And to just sort of give you an idea of how this background mortality operates over a period of time in structural development, I've put put those different structural classes that I was talking about into developmental stages, subjectively, of course, just to sort of show you the patterns. And surprisingly, in Western hemlock, we see very, very low mortality rates in these early developmental stages. And I think that these are much lower than expected and other studies have found, but I think it's potentially the result of thinning that's gone on out there in managed stands. And then as we go through the mid stages of development, it peaks up above 1% there, and in these mature stages, these are sort of high biomass with high density. We see it really peak up there at about 1.75% per year. And then once we get into the late and old growth stages, we're up at maybe 1.2% per year. And so this sort of corroborates the findings of those higher mortality rates in older forests across the region. We see a different pattern if we look at the dry forests. Here I've grouped Douglas fir and grand fir together, and a lot of variation in those early developmental stages. But as these stands potentially develop, we see that mortality is much, much higher in these later and old growth stages, almost 1.5% per year. That's pretty high compared to what's been reported from previous studies the end of the 20th century. So it's only really part of the story though, right? There's also things like wildfires out there. And so what I'm going to show you now are the distributions of mortality rates across the whole Western hemlock vegetation zone. These are just stands greater than 80. And again, when we look at this, we can see that, yeah, a little over 50% of those mortality rates are up above 1%. In Western hemlock, a lot of that is probably associated with pathogen activity. Less of a role of insects. And then, you know, in the absence of sort of one of these external disturbances, fire, landslide, flood, mortality rates are pretty much limited to less than 5% per year. But what we can look at is that fire is really making up a very, very small proportion. I think I estimated that maybe of the whole Western hemlock vegetation zone, maybe 2.5% or 2% has been affected by fire. And we can see that fire is operating across a range of levels of severity. Stand replacing mortality would be 25% per year. Very, very, very small proportion, less than 0.5%, I think, of the total area. And so we see fire operating at sort of a lower range of severity levels in Western hemlock. If we switch to the drier forests, we see a very, very different story. Again, we see that most of the rates are up above 1% per year. We see that insects are playing a much greater role, pushing some of those rates to higher levels. But the real story again here is with wildfire. And so stand replacing mortality rates, greater than 25% per year, that's about 2.5–5% of that entire Douglas fir, grand fir, white fir vegetation zone. 2.5% in a 10-year period, is that a lot? Is it a little? Remains to be seen, I guess. But regardless, most of the fire is operating at some of these lower levels of mortality. We can see that it's burning across the whole spectrum. And so fire is out there. It is causing a fair amount of stand replacement, but it's also potentially decreasing density of forests and potentially restoring some of the historical structure that may have been out there. So mortality is interesting, and you know, mortality is a dominant process, particularly in terms of structural development. But just looking at the rates themselves still doesn't give us a great idea of how these forests are changing. And so here I have some pictures, and for the sake of the exercise, let's just assume that these all have a mortality rate of 2.5% per year. And the point I'm trying to make is that mortality can operate different ways in different stands. On the far left, you can see that there's a bunch of big trees that have died, whereas over on the far right, there's been a lot of mortality in the smaller trees. And so the mortality rate may be the same, but the structural change can be really, really vastly different. And so what I've done is I've expanded upon an existing framework from Coombs in 2007, and I'm going to give you a quick overview of how that works to sort of help us narrow down and figure out what mortality means in terms of structural change. So here I have this little cartoon figure, and on the x-axis is mean tree size, quadratic mean diameter. And so over here on the left we have small trees, and on the right we have large trees. And then on the y-axis, it's trees per hectare. So this is stand density. And again, down at the bottom we have few trees, and at the top we have many trees. And if you take a stand and measure it at 2 points in time, and plot the beginning point and the end point, time 1 and time 2, there's 4 different ways that vectors of change, I'll call them. There's 4 different ways that these arrows can go. And in the first one, density can increase and quadratic mean diameter might decrease. And so this might be from infilling in a woodland, lots of trees being recruited, densification. It could be understory reinitiation in an older forest. Could also be loss of big trees. So there's multiple processes that could lead to this trajectory. The next one is a grading. And so this is where your average tree size and your number of trees both increase. And this is really largely a process of the result of recruitment and growth. Down in the other quadrant, where your number of trees is decreasing and your mean tree size is decreasing, I call this dieback. And this might mean top-down mortality. And so this might happen, a windstorm might come in and remove a couple big trees that subsequently knock down lots of smaller trees. And before the understory regenerates, we might see this type of pattern. The release of advanced regeneration in canopy gaps, things like that. And then finally, maybe the one that people are most familiar with is this sort of self-thinning, where the number of trees in your stand is going to decrease, but on average, the tree size is going to get bigger. And so this is going to be the result of what I call bottom-up mortality. So asymmetric competition where bigger trees are excluding smaller trees. Could also be associated with low-severity fire, where the smaller trees are preferentially killed. And so if we look at the western hemlock vegetation zone and strictly old growth, and these numbers here that I'm presenting come from across all of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. And so this is really those extremely high live biomass structural classes. We see that most of it is going through this sort of period of thinning, about 74% of it. Dieback is affecting a very, very small proportion. About 16% are getting denser, and about 8% are getting are grading. The numbers are actually fairly same if you look at old growth, Douglas fir, white fir, grand fir across, again, this is all of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, where most of the stands are going through this sort of self-thinning, 62%. It's interesting that even despite drought and insects and wildfires, that almost a quarter of these are even still getting denser. So it provides a little bit of a framework to start thinking about structural change. And so if we go back and look again at the mortality distributions, what I have here is on the top I have rate class across the bottom, and then proportion of plots. And then there's a little key over there that tells you which of these trajectories is going on. And so we look at really, really low mortality rates. We see a little bit of everything going on. But as we increase into these higher mortality rates, where things like insects and fire are playing a much greater role, we see that stands are predominantly, if not exclusively, thinning. So even in this greater than 25% per year, this stand replacing mortality, we have sort of a thinning effect. And that probably means that maybe there's one live tree left. If we go to the Douglas fir, grand fir, and do the same thing, we see remarkably similar patterns here. At the lower levels of mortality, there's sort of a mix of potential structural development that's going on. But as we go further along, 10 to 25% per year, 5 to 10% per year, and even in the stand replacing, we see that there's sort of this thinning effect. And so the message here is that these fires are going through, and they may have 10 to 25% per year is a pretty high mortality rate. but it's likely that the bigger trees are surviving, and so that backbone of structure is still there despite really, really high mortality. And so finally, just to quickly review, we have relatively high levels of mortality in these stands over 80 years. The effects of fire are tremendously variable across the region. Western hemlock, standard placing fire in maybe 0.5% of the region, where we're up to about 2.5%, and some of the grand fir, white fir, and Douglas fir. Some of this suggests that there may be a lot of mortality going on, but mostly what's happening is maybe a region-wide thinning episode. And so future changes down the road are really going to depend on the relative importance of these stand-level processes that are associated with background mortality versus the more disturbance-driven mortality that we've seen in dry forests. And then just some acknowledgements. This is largely work that came out of my dissertation that was funded by Region 6. Thanks to the Lemma team that's really provided most of the data summaries for me, and then my advisor, Tom Spies, and some other folks that have contributed. If there's any questions, maybe Jane wants to come back up. Uh-huh.
Actually, this question is I guess for Jane. Are there many or any studies of fire frequency prior to, say, the mid-1700s? That is, prior to Native American diseases, et cetera, et cetera. And I ask that because there's one study from the Kootenai National Forest looking at charcoal levels that showed a huge change after 1800 and then in the late 1800s, big fires, I think. Anyway, any studies?
So the question is, are there fire history studies that encompass the time period prior to the 1700s? Yeah. And yes, in fact, there are several studies. Obviously, the further back you go in time, especially in frequent fire regimes, if you're using dendrological means to get at the data, it gets more and more complicated because you may or may not have the sample size to do that. And I believe that's why folks went more to the looking at charcoal and lake sediments. And the problem with that is that the scale or the precision of collecting that information is somewhat coarse. So, for instance, really getting at a fire return interval in terms of the number of years gets more difficult when you're looking at charcoal and sediments. So there is information out there. It's somewhat variable, maybe less from the dendro record than from the charcoal and sediment, but you're losing some of your precision, I think, once you go to that. So we can talk later about some of the studies.
One more. This is simplifying it. Help me understand, Matt. When you say 2.5% mortality rate, does that mean 100% of the total subtract 2.5% per year?
The question is if a mortality rate is 2.5% per year, yeah, that means that every year 2.5% of your individuals are dying.
And if that's the case, and it takes 180 years to make a whatever forest, how would we not be falling?
Recruitment. So trees are also recruited in. And so potentially with a very rapidly growing stand, you could have like in young stands, potentially you might have high mortality rate. And so you might be losing individuals, but because growth and recruitment are so high, you would maintain positive biomass accumulation, if that makes sense.
Help me thank these guys, everybody.